Hello everyone and welcome back to Perth South and another occasional video about my model railway. It's taken a while, but at long last I've completed some real scenery, Moncreiffe Tunnel and the hillside above. It's not an exact model of the tunnel entrance, nor indeed the hillside above, but it looks reasonably good and it provides the necessary scenic break for this end of the layout. But before I take you back a few months to when I was starting this work, let's take a look at the real Moncreiffe Tunnel. This is a 1,220 yard long tunnel running pretty well north-south, taking the double track line under the low ground between Moncreiffe Hill and Curtin Hill, just south of Perth. Hilton Junction, where the line splits off for Fife and Edinburgh, is immediately south of the tunnel, hence this splitting distant colour light signal just before the tunnel. I understand that this splitting distance signal is the only one remaining in the UK rail network. Says something about the age of the signalling at Perth. My layout is very foreshortened and I would need a further 20 feet between the end of my MPD area and the tunnel if I were working to scale. I've also had to miss out an overbridge that carries Friarton Road over the railway just before the tunnel. But let me now take you back a few months to the start of the work, where I'll explain some of the challenges in building this tunnel and hillside. Well, as I said in the last video, the next stage of build is to construct a hillside and tunnel for the scenic break at this south end of the layout. And the tunnel here is only roughly positioned at the moment. But there are a number of complications here, partly because, as you can see, this board is built in the open framework L girder principle. And the reason for doing that was because of the complex track geometry in this area, the vertical geometry, with these tracks starting to go downhill and these tracks rising up in this direction. And of course, I can't just place a piece of foam insulation here and carve it to shape. And equally in this side, although these tracks are going to be hidden, I still want access to them to rescue any trains that get stuck or that derail. There's also an issue about the back scene. I want to be able to independently remove this back scene and keep it separate from the physical scenery around the tunnel area. And then there's a further complication in that this section of the board is an extension, and that's there because of the limited space I have on the access hatch into the loft, and I was limited in the size of board that I can lift through the hatch, and equally if I ever dismantle the layout that I can get back down through the hatch again. So I want to try and maintain my ability to separate the layout into its various components if I have to in future. So a kind of complicated picture here in terms of how I go about this, and I'll now go on to the build and show you how I intend to do it. So the first thing was to remove the back scene boards. I plan to change these to fit in with the hillside scene and do away with this townscape, which was really a leftover when I first did the back scene boards. So the first part of the build was to cut and fit a backboard that the physical scenery could connect to and sit on. That had to be cut to the shape of the hillside, and when it was fitted it was important to leave a gap behind it between the backboard and the uprights for the back scene, so that the back scene boards could still slot in behind the scenery. I fitted a flat board on the inside between the tunnel and the buffer stops of the MPD, as that was the one area that I would be able to lay some Celotex and carve that to shape. So when I made up the framework for the original main frame of the layout, I cut some very shallow angled timber here so that it kind of joined up in a line. But there's really no need to do that for the upper parts here, which are just supporting scenery. However, the upper part is going to be slightly out of line with the lower part. So when I put the fascia on, I'm going to pack it out a bit at the top so that it brings it in line with the lower timber here. And especially as it has to meet up with the next section, which is going to be separate from this. This is going to be removable as part of this section of the baseboard here. Also here we've got the pockets where I can get in to sort any derailments or catch any vehicles that have become detached. Oh dear, what a mess. I've now fitted another piece of plywood on the opposite side of the track, and this is going to be removable so that the section of timber frame that I spoke about a few minutes ago can be removed if need be. In this view you'll see that I've fitted a number of shaped plywood and timber uprights to support the chicken mesh which will go on top. And here I've now fitted the inner fascia, and that basically completes the timber work, timber supports before I fit the chicken mesh. I've also got another duplicate second fascia which will go on top once the chicken mesh and the initial plaster work is complete. Next we come to the chicken mesh, cutting it and bending it to shape. Now before I go any further I need to fit the tunnel portal, and before I do that I'll do some initial weathering. I'm not sure who makes this model of a tunnel portal. I bought it from Squires a short number of months ago, and I'll admit it's not exactly the same as the tunnel portal at Moncreiffe, but it's a close enough match for me. I used a dry brushing technique using a mixture of colours, and I kept the grey plastic colour in the background as the mortar, but I did apply a lot more weathering once the tunnel portal was in place in the layout. I pinned the tunnel portal in place in the layout and made up a section of tunnel lining to represent the first few metres of the tunnel itself. And of course ran some coaches through the tunnel to check clearances. Then it was time for covering the track with cling film before I fixed the mesh in place and started the messy plaster bandage work. So with the tunnel portal in place and the track suitably protected, I started pinning the chicken mesh in place using a staple gun. And after fixing in place, I trimmed the edges to remove the excess mesh. I cut the mesh round the tunnel portal and carefully tucked it in behind. And then the final panels of chicken mesh were pinned into place, and everything was ready for the start of plaster bandaging. I used the Pico plaster bandage. I just find them a bit easier to use. They're a bit stiffer and easier to cut. I cut them in various lengths, usually 10 inches to a foot long. Sometimes cut to fit a particular shape in the mesh, and it was just a process of soaking each piece and carefully placing it and then smoothing it out. You can see that the mesh is still quite flexible, it moves quite a bit, so I was concerned to make this whole thing quite stiff, and eventually laid 3 layers of plaster bandage, and as you'll see shortly, that was followed by applying some Sculptamold. Around the tunnel portal, the bandage was tucked in behind the head wall and wing walls. So the first layer of plaster bandage is complete, and the final thing looks like a bit of a snow scene. I cut some Celotex for the area in front of the tunnel and fixed it in place with a hot glue gun. I tried to get the angle of the slopes looking reasonably correct and realistic, and ended up building it up in layers. This is actually the first time in the layout I've used a hot glue gun, so it was a bit of a new experience for me. It's certainly ideal for doing this kind of work. So after applying various strings of glue, I fitted the top layer of Celotex and held it in place until the glue cooled down and stuck the two surfaces together. I added plaster bandage to the top of the Celotex, but you'll see I haven't done the whole thing, and the section on the right will be subject to some additional scenic work which I'll hope to cover in the next video. Now you'll notice some chicken mesh fixed to the backboard adjacent to the tunnel. Because the tunnel entrance is so close to the edge of the board, I couldn't get a normal cutting slope there, so I decided to create a rock wall. Now I thought about doing a stone or a brick wall, but decided to try and model solid rock instead. So again, this was a bit of a new thing for me. So I decided to use Sculptamold to form the rock cutting, and I've gathered together a few tools to help scrape and carve the plaster to shape. I mixed it roughly 2 parts Sculptamold to 1 part water, although in truth I kept adding water until I was happy that it was a soft kind of sticky dough. Actually probably more like soft cheese. To make and paint the rock, I'm using techniques shown by YouTuber, and let me get this right, BNSF UP Railroader. I'll try and put a link in at the end, and his rocks really do look superb and very realistic. So you can see I've started spreading some Sculptamold onto the wire mesh, filling the gap between the tunnel and the rest of the scenery. And I've decided to go for sort of vertical columnar shaped rocks rather than a flat rock face. Cutting in a few horizontal ledges as well. And once the Sculptamold starts going off, getting a little bit harder, you can start carving it and slicing it to make whatever shape of rock you want. The tunnel portal, I've pulled the wing wall forward, more parallel with the track, and slipped some Scultamold in behind so that it, as best as possible, seamlessly joins into the wall, the wing wall of the tunnel. And at the other side, join it into the sloped shape of the plaster covered Celotex. If you want to change the shape or smooth it out, you can sprinkle some water on and soften up the Sculptamold again. See here, I'm just using my hand and some water to smooth off the plaster onto the plaster bandage. So I'm just using all the tools available to continue shaping the rocks, including an old paintbrush to brush down some loose material, and cutting in some ledges in the rock. So after several more minutes of working in the rock cutting, the next stage was to start pinning the fascia in place. This will cover the plaster bandage, which is folded over the edge of the formwork, and allow me then to fill in that gap with some more Sculptamold, creating a nice neat finish at the edges. So I'm now using a softer mix of Sculptamold to fill in the gap between the plaster bandage and the fascia, giving it a nice smooth finish. But I'm also going to use it to cover the plaster bandage. This is partly to add more strength, but also to fill in some of the slightly unnatural dips and hollows in the hillside. And this was just due to the chicken mesh drooping slightly between all the timber supports. Well, I'm afraid my camera ran out of memory just as I was starting to spread the Sculptamold over the hillside. So I'm afraid you've missed that bit, but this is a few days later and it is all now quite hard. The only bit which hasn't quite fully hardened is the rock face, which you can see it's still got a slight yellow colour and it's actually still quite waxy and soft. So I'm going to have to let that dry off for a few more days before I can paint it. I think I can paint the rest of this area meantime. So I've got a suitably muddy brown colour to paint the Sculptamold with, so let's go on with it. Well, a few days later and the rock face is now hard enough to paint, and again following the guidance from the YouTuber I mentioned earlier on, he uses a mixture of different shades, all heavily watered down, and it seems to work well with the watery paint soaking into all the crevices and giving the rock different shades. Well, you can see here I've started my purchases of scatters and static grass. I've got my static grass applicator here, and a whole bundle of different shades of scatters, and there's a pile of static grass in there as well. So that lets me go on with the real scenery. You can see I've got some rubberized horsehair here. I'll be getting some other clump foliage as well. There's a few things in here somewhere, maybe in the bottom. I've got some some tufts and whatnot. So hopefully get stuck into it now. I've used a mixture of Javis scatters. I've got no particular preference for them, it's just what I was able to get hold of fairly easily. And for the different areas of the hillside, I've used a mixture of spring mix, rough pasture, light meadow green and heath green. I'm not really sure how important it is to apply scatters before laying static grass on top. I've done it anyway, that's the way I tend to do it, and I think it does help. With the scatters complete, it's time to add another coat of paint to the rock face. I'm using a darker brown this time, but equally as watery as before. In fact, you'll see that I add yet more water to it. With the scatter dry, it's time to suck up the excess and recover as much of it as possible by putting an old sock over the end of the suction hose. I've gathered together a variety of static grasses, a mixture of woodland scenics, Javis, green scenes, again whatever I could easily get hold of. To apply the static grass, I've just used a PVA water mix and brushed it on, doing very roughly a square foot at a time, just enough so that it doesn't dry out too much before you actually put on the static grass. I've used different static grasses and different lengths and shades for the different areas of the hillside. So the area that's going to have some sheep is going to be quite short, some scrubby grass and tufts. The areas where I plan to have trees will be more kind of browny colour. The areas next to the track maybe slightly longer, and again different shades of brown and green, burnt grass and spring grass. So for the first coats of static grass, I've used various combinations of the Javis 2mm summer mix, spring mix, and also the woodland scenic burnt grass. For the second coat, longer 6mm and 10mm grasses, and to apply that second coat I've used a spray glue rather than the brush. Once again I've used the old sock over the end of the hoover technique to suck up the excess grass so that it can be reused. So after various coats and combinations, this is the finished base coating of static grass before I start adding tufts, bushes and small areas of longer grass. To recreate the kind of long straggly grass that you sometimes get in wet areas and upland pastures, I've used some longer 10mm static grass. I've applied some random spots of PVA and then used the applicator with the 10mm strands in the application cup. Now, to make sure these strands, these very long strands, stay upright, I've actually used the hoover to suck them and draw them upwards. The applicator I've got is only designed for up to 6mm static grass, so the hoover helps draw these longer strands upright. Next we'll add some of the Javis tufts. I found I needed to glue these down. the sticky label on the back of each tuft just not enough to hold it to the static grass. So I added a spot of PVA to each one. I wanted the rock face to look a bit grassy and overgrown, so I painted on some PVA and applied some short static grass to the rock. I wanted to add some gorse bushes and broom and general hedgerows. So I cut some of the rubberized horsehair into strips, and then I made up a mixture of Woodland Scenics coarse turf medium green with a scattering of Woodland Scenics blended turf earth blend. And then I added some Woodland Scenics coarse turf yellow grass. The idea of this being to look a bit like the flowers and gorse bushes. The mixture was given a good shake in a plastic box to make sure it was all mixed, and then each strip of hedge was soaked in the PVA water mixture, and the coarse turf mixture sprinkled on top. Then it was a case of gluing each section of hedge into place using yet more PVA. The same method was used to create individual bushes at various points in the hillside. And now, with most of the scenic treatments round the tunnel in place, it was time to remove the cling film, reveal the tunnel portal and clean up the track and get trains running again. So after hoovering the track and cleaning the rails and touching up the scenery here and there, the end result actually looks quite good. At this stage I've still to add the back scene, fencing and a few more bushes, and then there's going to be some trees go on top as well. But at this stage I think I'm going to leave it there and come back in another couple of weeks' time with a video showing you the rest of the scenic treatments. Many thanks for staying with me if you've watched all the way through, and I'll hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.